Hi everyone, this is Tanya from Flying Dog Studio. Thank you so much for joining me as I continue with my Beatrix Potter study, and this time I am adding watercolor. As you can see, my piece has already been inked. If you missed that first video where I inked this piece with my Sailor Fude de Mannen pen, I'm going to link that down below and you can watch me ink this piece and see how I like the pen. Let's take a look at the supplies. I am going to be using the Royal and Langnickel round brushes, size 8, size 2. I have my Windsor and Newton watercolors. I have 2 cups of water, one for rinsing the brush and then one for mixing colors. On my palette, I'm starting out with some Windsor blue and Payne's gray. If I'm talking and I miss telling you the colors, just look on the screen when we do a close-up of the palette. It's either going to be at the top, middle, or bottom portion of the screen, depending on where I'm mixing. And those are the colors that we are going to be using. It's really rather a limited palette. She's sticking with some blues and browns and one yellow, and these are not the exact colors she would have used. I have no idea what brand she used, but this is what I am using as what I had at home, so use what you have. I started out doing a wash of just some water on there, just putting down some clear water, and I'm doing wet on wet, so I'm dropping in the blue. I had a little bit of blue in my brush, so that's why you're seeing a light blue underneath the wash I'm putting down now. When I studied Beatrix Potter's work, I noticed that she doesn't have a tremendous amount of washes. For me, washes are life. I put down wash on everything. Sometimes I will cover the entire page in a wash and then come back and add colors on top. And for Beatrix Potter, I noticed she does have some washes in areas, but she mainly uses something that I would refer to as dry brushing, which sounds strange to say when you're working with watercolor, but you can tell she uses a small brush and very little water to get those types of brush strokes, especially on fur. So I'm going to continue on here and add in all of the what I'm going to call washes to get a good base on here, and then I'm going to come back and add some color on top. And to me, it looked as if this is what she did. I'm not certain, but I'm just going to try to mimic the piece and see if I can get the same results. When I finished the ground in front of the door, I took a look at the door and I realized it needs a little bit of a weathered look, and it does have some of this ground color up in it. Well, the only problem with adding that in at this point is that that is already partially dried. Now this is hot press paper, so it's allowing me to move some stuff around. But if I were to have put that color that I needed only in that one spot, what would have happened is that I would have had the ballooning out of the color. And I'm sure all of you that are watching that are used to doing watercolors, you're like, oh, why is she doing that? I realized what I was doing, and I thought, you know, I'm going to have to go ahead and just add some clear water onto the rest of it, activate everything, so this will all kind of blend together. So that's what you see me doing here. I really only wanted that kind of brownish color right in the middle, so that's why I added that in, and then that's why I came back with the just kind of clear water around everything else. So we're going to move over to the little wall behind Peter Rabbit, and I'm not going to be careful of the greenery. The greenery has a lot of sort of a yellow green in it, so it was okay to me to go ahead and put this as a wash and not be so careful about the greenery. I just said a few minutes earlier that for the fur, I can tell that she used kind of a dry brushing technique, but I took a look at the piece and there's some smooth underneath, and I didn't know how else to get that smooth layer of color underneath other than to add a wash. So I'm adding a wash, but I'm not adding in every spot because she does use the white of her paper to create some of these white spots on the fur and in the rabbit. And you'll notice on his little tummy, right underneath his little elbow there, you'll see my pencil mark. And I did leave some pencil marks like that I didn't ink in because she had not inked them in. And I wanted to kind of have a guideline where I wanted brown fur, but yet I wanted to keep that little belly area white. So this, I'm hoping, is how she did it, but we're going to proceed with this and then come back and add some texture on top. And I am going to let all of this dry before I come back with that dry brushing technique. So at this point, I'm wanting to mix the color for the fur. And I really should start in the background, but I was anxious to do the rabbit. I'm mixing with my size 8 brush, and I just did something. If you've watched my other videos, I never do. I add black to this color. And I realized that I cannot think like an impressionist painting. If I'm going to paint like other painters, I can only think that way if I am doing my style of art, but I'm doing someone else's. So in order to get the color that she used, I felt I needed to add that black in there to make it more of a shade and kind of knock back that brightness. So the dry brush technique that I mentioned, I have mixed up the color. You can see it on my palette. I have switched to the size 2 brush. Even though I mixed it with the size 8, I've switched to the size 2, and I am not adding water to my brush. I'm only using what is on the palette. And you can see over to the left hand side of my palette, it is rather concentrated. Where it has ran over there, there's a little bit more pigment. When I need darker areas, I'll dip over in that. And a lot of my paint, I go ahead and let it dry, and I barely add any water back into it. And I'm keeping my brush basically dry. So the only water that it is picking up is what is on that palette. And I'm trying to go just from one color at a time. I'm not going back and forth and adding colors because her painting seems so complicated, yet it's so simple. It looks, in my opinion, as if she does simple colors and takes them through like this, just one at a time. And there's not a lot of layering as far as the fur texture, but the way she did it, I need so much more practice. So I hope you will follow along, because this is going to be a series where I am going to diligently try to learn how to paint like Beatrix Potter. So I hope you will follow along with this. Now, I got a little bit dark up there on his paw, and that I did use some water. I needed to move that around. That was actually smooth. She did not have texture there. I am using, as she did, little brush strokes on the fur, and this is exactly why I saved those pencil lines and didn't erase them, because I needed that area to show me where to put those little fur marks. So you can see, just going back over, letting a little area dry, coming back with the same color, I can get a darker shade. And I'm careful to leave some of that light underneath, and that is giving us that wonderful fur texture. So I'm going to keep painting, and I'm going to hop back on in a minute and tell you a little bit more about what I'm doing. Up to this point on the rabbit's fur, I have been using basically the same colors. I only darkened that brown just a little bit to get that second layer of fur. I'm now coming in with a completely different shade. We're using some Payne's gray and some black, and I'm dabbing these colors in. This is the darkest fur and the shadows. And if you watch the first video, I talked about how she used weighted lines to create those areas where she was going to have shadow, or where the fur might be a bit thicker, or something may have a little bit darker color in that area. And that's what she's done. So I'm trying to follow her roadmap on this, and I'm putting these darker colors on top. So basically what I can tell from her work is that she starts with the lighter watercolors and then gradually adds the darker on top. If you've watched any of my videos, you know I do that as well, but I also break the rules if there are rules in art, and I will add the dark colors on bottom and put the light colors on top. It kind of depends on the effect that I'm wanting to get. Now this is an area on the little belly area where I will use a little bit more water to kind of thin out that color, because I don't want a super dark color on the little tummy area, because that is a white area. So I'm going to keep on adding some shades here, and then we're going to switch over and do some more detail. Up to this point, we've really only used black, Payne's gray, and some browns, and a little bit of that yellow ochre. But now we need to work on the greenery that's running along the wall behind Peter Rabbit. So this is where I'm picking up that sap green. But again, I'm going back to those basic colors, the Payne's gray, and then I'll pick up some yellow ochre in order to make those greens kind of blend in with everything else. We don't want it a bright green. Everything's kind of muted in her work, so I'm trying to carry that along, and I'm going back and forth trying to get just the right color to add in to those leaves. And again, when she is adding these colors in and I'm mixing with my larger brush, it was just easier to mix with a larger brush, but I'm going to be using that size 2 to paint those leaves in. I want these colors super saturated, not a lot of water, and then if I want the colors darker, I'm going to come back and just paint on top of them once they're dry. At this point, I'm going to want to add a little bit of that original blue that we used on the door. So I'm using my size 2. I got just a little bit of water and reactivated that color. And that's what I was talking about earlier on in the video. If I'm going to use any of these other colors again, I'll add water, but not very much, so that I can continue using what I refer to as a dry brushing technique. So I'm going to continue on with the leaves, and I'll hop back on in just a second. I am adding black to this bottom color one more time, this little detail color that's pretty saturated, because there's an area right behind Peter Rabbit, right there underneath his tail, that was very shadowed, but she did not use ink to fill that in. She actually used color. So I decided I would do the same thing, and I also did the same thing on the lock at the top. That was another area I mentioned in the first video that to me it looked as if she had not used the ink. She simply used some dark paint to come back and paint that area in. Now that the wall is completely dry behind Peter Rabbit, I'm coming back into that same brown that we've been using not only for the wall but for the little rabbit himself, and I'm going to add some detail and some shading in down around the greenery, and I'm going to try to define the bricks. And you might notice right in the area where I'm painting that looks almost gray. What happened there is my ink bled. Now that ink had been drying for over 24 hours before I came back to paint on this. I got busy and I had to let it set for a day or two. But the ink bled, which was unusual. I am using Noodler's Catfish ink, and it's supposed to, not bleed like that and be reactivated. It's supposed to be pretty permanent, but obviously it bled just a little bit. It didn't hurt my feelings. To me, it added just a little bit more interest to the piece, so it didn't hurt my feelings a bit. But I'm going to keep on going through here and add some detail on these bricks. We have just a few more details to add to this piece before it's finished, and as you can see, we have kept a very limited palette. I've revisited the same colors. I have let areas dry, and I've come back and used the same colors on top, which allowed me, by layering like that, allowed me to get some darker shades. And this is what I've come up with for Beatrix Potter's work. This is not going to be my last attempt at this. Again, I'm going to have a series of this. I do hope you'll join me. Follow along. If you have any tips on what I'm doing, if you know some stuff about Beatrix Potter's work, please share that down below. I need to do some more research on her. I know I'm not using the same paints that she used, but I'm hoping they're pretty close. So thank you so much for joining. I always appreciate your being here. I hope you will join me in the future, and I will see you in the next one.